Hi, everyone, and good afternoon. My name is Mansoor Ahmed, and today I'll be talking about the topic data sharing across borders from a GDPR perspective, how the GDPR facilitate and what are the different challenges which exist for data sharing. Healthcare data is one of the most sensitive and dynamic nature of the data. So the different countries introduce several laws for the protection of the personal information. GDPR introduces the guidelines to protect individuals' data. So these guidelines are basically describes how sensitive information could be collected, and how it should be processed within or outside the organization and across borders. So basically, all organizations that deal with the sensitive data must comply with the GDPR compliance. So the GDPR basically talks about it's a regulation that will impact all health data processing companies because of the growing importance of the customer and patients data to be manufacturers business. So basically, it concerns the protection of the persons with regard to the processing of personal data and the free movement of such data. And it is basically the duty of the member states to maintain or to introduce further conditions if that are required for processing of the data related to health. So these are the 8 data privacy principles for the GDPR which need to be complied. The lawfulness states that the personal data shall be processed lawfully, fairly, and in a transparent way. The purpose of the personal data shall be the purpose limitation for the personal data which is being collected for some specific and explicit and legitimate purpose. And the storage limitations should be there. The personal data shall be kept in a form which permits basically the identification of the data subjects. Personal data shall be adequate, and it should be relevant and limited to what is necessary in relation to the purpose for which they are processed. Transparency should be there. The personal data shall be processed in a manner that ensures basically the appropriate security for the personal data, and unauthorized or unlawful processing unlawful processing and against any accidental loss should be taken care of. Accuracy of the data is important. And finally, the accountability, that means that the controller shall be responsible for and should be able to demonstrate compliance with the other data protection principles. So the data transfer, we have got some adequate jurisdiction for the cross-border data transfers. So these adequate decisions is influenced by the legal protection of the human rights of that specific country where the data resides. What are the different rules of the law for that country? How to cater with the data, accessing public authorities to transfer the data from one organization to another or to any other organization, existing data protections authorities and their functioning, and how the international commitments and obligations regarding the protection of the personal data exist. So if some adequate decisions are not there for the cross-border data transfer, then the GDPR allows for the safeguards, which basically states for the cross-border data transfers are allowed between the public authorities. It should be based on the legal binding and enforceable agreements between the public authorities. It should not require any specific data protection authority authorization for the transfer of the data, and the public authorities should ensure that the agreement is compliant to the GDPR requirements. So considering the environment, the healthcare ecosystem basically connects the stakeholders from multiple domains like patients, pharmaceutical, insurance companies, government agencies, and healthcare providers. So this ecosystem contains the patient-sensitive data, such as the personal identity, lab reports, real-time access to the IoT sensors. So this sensitive data is shared across borders for different purposes, and that could lead to some privacy and security issues. So the GDPR set the guidelines to protect the individual's data. So these guidelines describe how sensitive information could be collected and how it should be processed within and outside the organizations. So failing to comply with this could lead to heavy penalties. For example, the GDPR states 20 million euros or the 4% of the global revenue. So this electronic health, considering a person is traveling from country H to country D, or from country C to country G. So these electronic health records need to be transferred to that specific country where that person is traveling. So consider a scenario, for example, Alex, who is the Irish patient. He travels from Ireland to Germany, and he encounters the hospital emergency and need to be admitted to the German hospital. So for his better treatment, we need to have an access to his old records, for the old records, so that the doctor could give him a better treatment and can diagnose well for what need to be done with him. So the need to access for the mandatory data for the patient's medical history and the doctor authorization is required. So that is basically being taken from the EHR of the home country. So once this treatment is done, so this information need to be updated to the home country EHR for further treatments when he gets back to home. So there are three different concepts or the categories how the data is being divided. It could be the personal data, the sensitive personal data, or it could be the critical personal data. So the personal data, it is no restriction to the cross-border data transfer for processing. We just need the consent for that data and we can share the data. For the sensitive personal data, we need to take the explicit consent for that specific data which is being shared. And for the critical personal data, which is basically related to the government, is prohibited from being transferred outside of the country. Those regulations do not allow them to transfer. So those kind of critical personal data cannot be shared with other countries. But in some cases, for example, health-related data, that can always be shared with the third country, or the cross-border transfer can be done with that. So there are three questions which need to be, which are very important in this regard. So first most is why should patient share their data? Definitely to achieve the universal data access while travel across the borders. I just gave you an example for that. So when the patient travels from one country to another and encounters an emergency, so the doctor needs to have an access to the universal data access to give him the better treatment. So why the patient's medical history is important? Because the medical history can help healthcare providers to make precise diagnosis and the treatment. And does the traditional centralized EHRs management systems being efficient? So those are not traditional centralized systems are vulnerable and have security risks. So the legal concern and challenges in this regard are each organization is basically responsible for answering 4 Ws, which are what, why, who, and where data is processed. So on the other hand, from the data subjects or the patient point of view, so they should have a complete know-how of how their data is being collected and for what purpose it is being collected and how it is being processed and for how long it will be kept for some specific purpose. So the ultimate requirement for the data controller and the data processor and the data subject is that there should be a legal contract between them, between all these parties to come up for the collection and the process of the data. So the GDPR facilitates, in a sense, for the data sharing in five aspects: defining the user ownership and right over the data, and specific purposes for which the data is being used, and it also facilitates development of the tools, which basically gives control to the data owner to have access to their data. So it enables the transparency, which is important, and it facilitates the relationship between the stakeholders. GDPR is an enabler that basically makes it more appropriate for the transparent agreements, which could be beneficial for further research purpose and sharing the data with different stakeholders. So GDPR is a big asset to European Union, as it makes the system safe and helps to keeping the trust of the patient when it comes to sharing the health data. It defines and enables the sharing of anonymized statistics, and it is also easier to implement countries with which have got some previous existing laws regarding the privacy and security of the data. There are some challenges which GDPR, when the GDPR came into existence. So these are a few of the challenges which are being faced by different organizations. So the most important ones are when it comes to the rare disease, we can all, the data is potentially basically identifiable. So access to the individual's data is restricted to the third parties. So only the aggregated results are shared with the GDPR privacy concerns, and sometimes used as an excuse to stop sharing the data. So the locally there are differences between the countries as how strict they are about the interpretation of the GDPR, and some specific laws which basically represents a barrier. So the other most important thing is the GDPR slows down the process. The idea behind the GDPR is basically not to have the barriers or the difficulties in sharing the information, whereas the same research can still be conducted, but the process is just slower and it is more complicated. GDPR is unique in a sense that it is interesting regulation, but the interpretation and implementation of the GDPR has caused problems and represents a challenge in Europe, which needs to be addressed. And there are much more concerns about the data protection, which makes it more, I should say, difficult to share data for scientific purpose. So basically, GDPR limits some projects to only share the aggregated data as a way to avoid sharing individual level data. And there are not sufficient tools and technology which exist to comply with the GDPR. And once the information is being shared, and if for any XYZ reason the data get leaks, so what are the risks associated to the data? And finally, how the data management will be done when the data is being shared with the across the borders. So these are some challenges which exist and which need to be overcome over the time, so to properly comply with the GDPR compliance. So this is the contact information. And yeah, if you have any questions, and we are open to the floor.
Thanks, Mansoor. Any questions from anybody in the audience? Any thoughts or observations even?
Hello, you guys hear me?
Yes, Douglas. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Masood. Thanks for the presentation. Actually, I was just wondering why, maybe out of curiosity from your perspective, why do you think that still we see big fines? You know, like for example, Meta, some companies, even though we have GDPR,
Mhm.
like the principles and so on, we still see that they have millions of fines in some news. I was just wondering if you think it's related to these challenges, like they maybe don't use the right tools, or there is still something missing which they could improve on their, you know, GDPR or privacy policies. Uh, do you see some direction on how they could actually better avoid these issues?
Yeah, just to give you an example, a few days back, the Instagram was fined more than 20 billion euros for the data leakage. So they do have the tools. Some of the times, what happens is they know the GDPR compliance and what are the different privacy rules and how to share the data and all that stuff. But still, sometimes those I should say the systems are not get compromised, and for example if the data get leaks, so there is always a penalty for that, because the GDPR states about the privacy of the data. So if the data get leaks and it is related to the personal information, then definitely the heavy fines are given in regard to that. So they know everything, but you know the systems cannot be 100% correct. So there are loopholes which does exist. So any intruder can have an access to the information, and when such kind of things happen, so they are heavily fined for that.
Okay, thanks.
Mhm.
For that. So that's the last of our Coffee and Talk for this year, for 2022. We'll be back in January 5th with our next one. Just waiting for confirmation on details for that. But thanks for joining us today, and have a great Christmas, everybody, and look forward to seeing you again in the new year.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone.